السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، ناصر المؤمنين المستضعفين، قاهر الجبابرة الطواغيت الظالمين، الذي جعل العاقبة للمتقين والعدوان على الظالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين محمد وآله وصحبه أجمعين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد، اللهم انفعنا بما علمتنا وعلمنا ما ينفعنا وزدنا علما وفقها في الدين يا رب العالمين. Inshallah, as always, we'll start with a quick summary of last week's session, inshallah, just so that we can jog our memories. So last week we went through a few points with regards to the war that took place in Lebanon in 1982, and we covered the moving or the removal of the PLO from Lebanon by Beirut and their headquarters being relocated to Tunisia. So 15,000 fighters, they left. We discussed the leadership of Lebanon, the presidents that came into power, the allies of Israel, the local forces that were there, the local parties. We discussed the massacres, the famous massacres of Sabra and Shatila in the refugee camps, where over 2,700 Palestinians, at least 2,700 Palestinians were massacred under command of Ariel Sharon. And we discussed the UN resolution which said that this was an act of genocide. For those of you, I assume everyone is following the current statements that have been made today by the ICJ with regards to what's the case that was brought before it by South Africa. You can look at it in light of this UN resolution, what happened after that, and then the reaction that took place within Israel, where there was a backlash against Ariel Sharon. There were some demonstrations in 1982, but he was then later elected as the Prime Minister in 2001. And thereafter we showed a couple of maps. We showed the map before and then we showed the map after of how the Israeli forces had taken over Lebanon. So the green area is the Syrian forces, the blue is the UN, and the pink are the Israeli government aligned Lebanese front militias or army, and the yellow is controlled directly by the Israeli army, and it's under direct Israeli occupation and control. And this continued until the year 2000, but we'll get to that when we cover those years, inshallah. And then we discussed the situation within Palestine, because as we said, we discussed a lot of the other countries. We discussed a lot about Egypt, specifically Egypt. We discussed the PLO in Jordan, then Syria, then Lebanon. So within Palestine, on a daily basis, again, the Palestinians are going through humiliation, military control, etc., unfavorable education, unfavorable economic circumstances, etc. And we discussed all of this in detail last week. So we covered these points. We generally discussed that although the leadership generally of the Palestinians was external, there wasn't much internal leadership. So the known organizations, etc., they were all based outside the country. They weren't based within the borders of what was known as Palestine, and obviously the whole area was under the control of the Israeli government. So anyone who was there were always imprisoned, as we mentioned, the thousands of imprisonments and jailings, etc. So the leadership was external. There were attempts, as we said, inside for resistance. There was armed resistance taking place, but it was here and there, few operations here and there. There wasn't a group as per se with its leadership based inside the Palestinian territories. And then we started discussing the Islamic or the Islamic viewpoint of the situation, and this is where we'll start off from today, inshallah. So we have the Islamic movements in Palestine. Now, as we said, at the beginning of in the first few weeks, once we reached the British mandate in Palestine, so the end, at the time of the First World War, the end of the Ottoman rule. This was basically the end of Islamic governance in the land of Palestine. And after that, slowly, obviously, since before that, there was the nationalism that had crept in, which we discussed. And then we haven't really touched on any kind of Islamic movement within the lands of Masjid al-Aqsa and the surrounding areas. This doesn't mean that there wasn't anything there, but it wasn't very strong. It wasn't very strong. So we had in 1948, when all of the Arab countries, the Allied, they went inside the 1948 war, and we mentioned last week that the battalions that were fighting, or the units that were fighting on behalf of the Egyptian army in the area of Gaza specifically, were generally volunteers from the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood at that time, in 1948. And so this was an influx of Islamic-minded individuals who entered into Gaza. They stayed there for a period of time until eventually they were driven out by the Israeli army in the attacks that took place when Israel completely conquered and occupied the Gaza Strip. So this was, you could say, the first Islamic influx in 1948. And this, obviously, the individuals, they stayed there in the military camps, and they had interactions with the locals, and so they had an influence on the locals who were there, on the students, on the teachers, on imams of masajid, etc. And then we discussed Nasserism, which took place in the 1960s, 70s, where Jamal Abdel Nasser, he had an outlook of pan-Arabism, and he aimed to be the leader of all the Arabs. We discussed that in detail, but as an offshoot of that was his anti-Islamic rules and anti-Islamic laws that he enacted and enforced inside Egypt and the territories under the control of Egypt, which at one point was even Gaza under his control. And so the propaganda was made against anyone who spoke about Islam, anyone who wanted to apparently practice Islam. So majority of what we can see today would be shunned in Egyptian society at that time under Jamal Abdel Nasser. It was very difficult, it was impossible, very difficult to keep a beard. Women, let alone the niqab, etc. Hijab was banned in certain places, etc. So the situation in Egypt became very you could say anti-Islamic under Jamal Abdel Nasser. And this obviously had a direct impact on Gaza, because Gaza was under the control of Jamal Abdel Nasser. And this had an impact on the population of Gaza, who then were influenced by the propaganda on the media channels, mainly the print media and the radio. Now, this did not mean that there was no Islamic work going on, no. So Islamic work continued. There were imams in the masajid, although they would get very little money at all, or for their work of being an imam in the masjid and being a khatib and leading the Jumu'ah. The amount that would get would be literally a bit of pocket money, even though they would have to be working full time. Our imams here are better off than the imams who were in Gaza at that time. So you could say they were getting about 20% of minimum wage. So a person would get 200 shekels a month, the imam would get 40. But that did not stop the imam. So in that way, generally most of the imams, they were doing it for the sake of Allah, not for the sake of the money, because the money wasn't really worth it anyway. So we had an Islamic center that was established in 1973. So this was the form of a charity, like we have charities. So it was called Al-Mujamma' Al-Islami in Arabic. The papers were then submitted. It was formally registered under the Israeli administration. So they authorized this as a charity to work. The main work that this charity was undertaking was running clinics, blood banks, daycare, medical facilities for the people. This was located in Gaza. Meals for those who couldn't afford it, youth clubs. They would have gyms, like physical activities taking place, etc. And so this is how they used to fund students to also go abroad and study, etc. In, for example, Saudi and other countries. So this Islamic Center was very active. It had a lot of social activities that it was taking part in, and it spread throughout Gaza, and it became a household name, almost you could say, in all different parts of Gaza, where its activities were being or its services were being provided to the local community all throughout Gaza. As related to this and related to the Islamic Center, a few years later we have in 1978 the Islamic University of Gaza. So while Egypt was running Gaza, they had established a branch, you could say, of Al-Azhar in Gaza. They had established a branch of Al-Azhar in Gaza. However, this branch of Al-Azhar in Gaza required certain requirements for the students to enter, etc. And what was happening by the time Israel had taken over Gaza was that the students, after graduating from school, etc., to be able to join the Azhar, whether it be in Cairo or anywhere else, to further their studies and graduate, they would have to wait a year or two. And so the time was basically wasted. So a submission was made by academics in Gaza that rather than the students just wasting their time, why don't we set up the foundation course in Gaza itself? And so this is where the Islamic University of Gaza was founded in 1978. And thereafter eventually started off as like an access course to foundation years, and then within a couple of years it became a full-blown university. So when the first batch of students came in as the foundation year, they didn't stop. They didn't the next year, they did the first year, then the next year they did second year, third year, and then they graduated the following year. So they completed the full course, and after that it had many different departments. Applications were made to the Israeli authorities at the time to register the nursing department. They didn't give permission for a number of years. They were waiting for almost 7 years until it was approved for them to have a nursing department, etc. And this university continued to expand. It's a very large university, and last year it had approximately 20,000 students. So it had a large number of students and graduates also. One of the president of the university, his name was Sufyan, and he was killed on the 10th, in December, on the 2nd of December, in an airstrike which targeted his home and killed him and all of his family. May Allah Azza wa Jal accept all of his efforts and accept his martyrdom. So he was the most recent president of the Islamic University of Gaza, who was killed last month with his whole family. The airstrike targeted his house. In fact, he was a professor and a researcher, scientist in Gaza. He was listed by Stanford University in the US from 2021 as amongst the top 2% of scientists in the world. Or the top 2% of the scientists in the world. And he was the president of the Islamic University of Gaza. Obviously, the Islamic University of Gaza has been destroyed. They attacked it in the first week of the airstrikes that took place in October. So they flattened all the buildings. It's not the first time. Obviously, this time the damage is much more extensive. It's basically completely demolished. But in 2014-15, if you remember, the war that took place then, they destroyed over 70 laboratories that were part of the university, and 2-3 departments were completely destroyed in 2014-15. So that was the Islamic University of Gaza, established in 1978. And then we have the goals of these Islamic centers and these movements that started in Gaza. So it was mainly the Islamic Center, which was the main hub and base for a lot of the activities that were taking place, especially in Gaza. They had links with the West Bank. The West Bank did not have in the same way setups as they did here in this part, so in Gaza. However, they did have connections on both sides. As we mentioned last week, that they were able to travel from between Gaza and the West Bank. Now, because the whole area is under Israeli control at this point, it's basically traveling within the same country. So now it's very difficult for a Palestinian to travel from Gaza to the West Bank and from West Bank to Gaza. You have to cross through the checkpoints, get entry into the Israeli state, and then from there you have to get permission to go out of the Israeli state again into the West Bank, and vice versa. At that time, because it was regarded as one state, there were some points where people could just, as you go through the West Bank, you could travel from the West Bank all the way to Gaza. Obviously there are checkpoints, etc. along the route, but you could travel. At certain points the rules were made more stringent, you had to have permits, etc. But you could travel from the West Bank to Gaza and from Gaza to the West Bank. So they did used to travel across these territories. Not like now, it's very difficult. And the goal of the movements was to revive Islam in the community. The goal was that the situation that they found themselves in, so the Palestinians, the Muslims in Palestine at that time, they said that the communities are far from Islam, and they are not acting upon the commandments of Islam as we should be. Therefore, we need to have a revival of Islam in our personal lives and our social lives. So Islam should be you should be practicing Islam in your personal life, and as a community we should all be Islamic also. So these were their main goals, and they were providing, as we said, all of these services for the Muslims. And from this was born the resistance, which had an Islamic theme in the Palestinian territories from this background. So they started off initially through da'wah, through social work, etc. Like we said, the clinics, medical facilities, youth clubs, etc. Food, charity, distribution, and thereafter, building on that, came the resistance against Israeli occupation. And this was, you could say, seen through many different forms initially. So when the Israeli forces completely occupied Gaza, for example, and they took over certain areas, they surrounded, for example, the Mukhayyam al-Shati, the refugee camp that's on the coast of Gaza. So the part of the Islamic Center members, etc., what they did was they that we are going to go out and we are going to demonstrate against this siege of our camp, refugee camp. And so they left after Jumu'ah, they did demonstration against the Israeli forces, etc. And they said, we're not going to move from here, and there will be civil unrest unless you stop the encirclement of this camp. And the Israeli forces stopped the siege, and they let the people carry on with their normal daily basis. So this started from a bit early on, but it wasn't on a continuous basis. As years went on, the resistance became more and more structured. So this is the background of, and this structure came into effect in the 1980s. And as you can see, by the 1980s, everything else has basically died out. The Arab states have stopped. There's no wars with any of the countries. Egypt, which had been their last hope due to the continuous or numerous wars that Egypt had with so all of this culminates. The things are going on back and forth all the time. So an Israeli army officer, for example, he kills a Palestinian. The Palestinians then go and demonstrate. Maybe they throw stones. Maybe they do something. Maybe they go to the police the Israeli police headquarters in their area and try to run it over, maybe hit a policeman or something. Then in return they are arrested, etc. So there's back and forth going on continuously. Some of the Palestinians kill an Israeli soldier, the Israelis come and arrest a Palestinian, kill a few other Palestinians, and so this back and forth goes on. But in the few years coming up to 1987, 1985, 1986, these attacks and these confrontations, for a better word, these confrontations increase in frequency, until eventually in 1987, in December, on the 8th of December, the Palestinians who are living in Gaza, and because obviously their population is very high because of the displacement in 1948, so the many refugees in Gaza, and their population is very high. Obviously they don't all have work inside Gaza, and so what they do is they work, as we described last week, in other areas that are under Israeli control. So in what is the Israeli state, they have work in those areas. So they work as laborers, they are employed as truck drivers, they are employed as laborers for building, etc. in the farmland. So these are the jobs that they are given, and until today this continues. So you will have seen in the first few weeks, approximately a month after the start of the escalation, you will have seen that Palestinians are returning back to Gaza in their thousands, and these Palestinians had been imprisoned by the Israeli forces. They were working inside the Green Line, meaning within what is the Israeli state, as laborers. All of them were rounded up and arrested, put into prisons for over a month, tortured, beaten, etc. And then they were all of the belongings were taken off them. You probably saw the witness statements of them returning back to Gaza across the border crossings in their thousands over a few days, where some of them were beaten. They had no knowledge of what's happened to their families, whether the families have been killed, whether they're still alive, etc. Some of them walked for kilometers, so many kilometers and miles, barefoot with nothing. And so they were working in the mainland or in the Israeli state, and they've been working since 1948, because obviously they need an income. They have nothing else to do. They need to provide for their families. So what happened on this specific day, on the 8th of December, was that the Palestinians were returning back to Gaza. And they have to wait in a queue, they have to go through Israeli checkpoints. So although Gaza and all of these areas are under Israeli control, but Gaza is still has border crossings. It has a number of limited entry points that they have. It's not like an open border, where you can go, because there are a lot of fields and mainly farmland. So there are a number of limited roads which you have entry into Gaza. And so they have to go through some of these specific roads to get back home. So they're coming through these roads. There are hundreds of Palestinians in cars, etc., sharing cars. They're all coming back to Gaza. And once they are waiting to cross at the checkpoint into Gaza, an IDF truck, so a tank transporter, crashes into cars that are waiting at the checkpoint. It crushes a number of cars. 4 Palestinians are killed, 7 are injured, and there are hundreds of Palestinians who see this whole incident taking place in front of them. So this takes place on the 8th of December. The next day, on the 9th of December, they have the funeral. 3 of those who were killed were from Jabalia refugee camp. 3 of those who were killed were from Jabalia refugee camp. The Israeli army said it was a mistake, it was just a traffic collision. The Palestinians said no, it was done on purpose in retaliation for an Israeli who was killed the day before, 2 days earlier. So the Palestinians, they come out for the Salatul Janazah and the funeral procession on the 9th. The funeral procession starts from the Jabalia refugee camp. They go to the graveyard thereafter, and they gathering many people. So thousands of people join the procession. thousands of people, upwards of 10,000. And obviously, as it's in the Jabalia refugee camp, there's loads of people there, so they all join the procession. Eventually, after the burial, they head towards the local police station, the local Israeli police station, and they throw stones, etc., and they confront the police outside the police station. The police respond by firing live rounds, and so one Palestinian is killed and dozens are injured. They eventually, at the end of the day, the Palestinians return back home. So this is the 9th. On the 10th, as a response, the students of the Islamic University of Gaza, they go to the hospital, to the As-Shifa hospital. So the injured were taken to As-Shifa hospital. And As-Shifa hospital, obviously we've heard a lot about it in the recent conflict. The As-Shifa hospital is a very old institution. It was established at the time of the British as a military barracks. During the British rule, it was a military barracks. It was then converted into a hospital just before 1948, and then it was used as a hospital during, so it was called Mustashfa Shifa and the Shifa hospital since before 1948. And it was continued to use as a hospital. The Israeli forces, when they took over Gaza, they took over the Shifa hospital, and they used the Shifa hospital as one of their central points, or where they were based while they were occupying Gaza. And obviously the British has used it as a military barracks, so there were underground places underneath the hospital. The Israeli forces expanded those underground tunnels and rooms, etc., and the basement, and used that for themselves for fortifications. So the injured are brought to the As-Shifa hospital. The students of the Islamic University of Gaza, they go to the hospital to donate blood, because a lot of them are as connected to the Islamic movement in Gaza and the charity. Thereafter, they again go out to confront and demonstrate against the Israeli retaliation against the mourners in the funeral, where they were demonstrating, throwing stones, but they were responded with live fire. So again, number are injured, etc. Then thereafter we have the day of Jumu'ah, which is the 11th of December. And thereafter the 12th of December is the Saturday, and again it continues, this time from Khan Yunus. So a different city, it's gone south now. And in this way, the protests and the Intifada, so Intifada means to shake off, etc. So this meant it was supposed to be an uprising to shake off the occupation and the oppression of Israel on the Palestinians. It was also called the Intifadat al-Hijara, or the stone Intifada, because in this Intifada, mainly the weapon that they used was stones. So in terms of the actions, what were they doing? So there was civil disobedience. They wouldn't listen to whatever was instructions were given to them by the Israeli command. They would set up roadblocks, so the roads were blocked either by concrete blocks or by burning tires. So they would get the tires, they would burn them, block off all the roads. Stone throwing, so they would throw stones at the Israeli military and police vehicles, settlers' vehicles. So again, there are two settlements now. There are settlements inside Gaza as well. So the Intifada starts from Gaza. And it's not every day in the same location. So as you mentioned, it was first Jabalia refugee camp, then it goes in Gaza city, Shifa hospital. Thereafter it moves south to Khan Yunus. So as you can see, it's moving around. They refused to pay tax. The tax which we discussed, where they had to pay to the Israeli government, who was using that tax to fund the forces to suppress the Palestinians and the resistance. A number of Palestinians were arrested for not paying tax, imprisoned for not paying tax, boycott. So they were boycotting products as well as work. So the Palestinians who are now working within employed by Israeli governmental agencies and Israeli businessmen, etc., and Israeli companies, they all stopped going to work. And in this period, of the Intifada, there was a massive impact on the economy on the Israeli economy, because the Palestinians weren't paying tax, the Palestinians were not going to work, The Palestinians were obviously blocking the roads, throwing stones, etc. They had to bring in more forces, and so this had a massive impact on the Israeli economy. At the same time, it was known amongst the settlers, etc., that this was a time where you couldn't drive a car in the streets unless you wanted your glass broken and a stone to come inside the car, because every single car that moved was attacked with stones. It starts off in Gaza, and then eventually in about a month and a half, it spreads throughout all of the regions, so it spreads to the West Bank as well. So within 1.5 months, it spread to all of these areas. The Intifada and the civil disobedience and protests, etc., they last officially until 1993. So officially, the final date is 1993. However, in practice, it ends in approximately October 1991. So it ends at the end of 1991. So they last 4 years in practice. On paper, they last until 1993, 6 years. And we'll see why that is, because obviously there were the agreements and the political changes that took place in 1991. Now, how did Israel respond to this? Now, previously, until this point, Israel has faced all-out war with the Arab states, and then Egypt on multiple occasions. It's been all-out war in Lebanon against armies. It's been at war against individual attacks, so against militants who are coming and fighting. This is the first time that they have to deal with a mass uprising of civilians. So basically for them it's civilians taking up stones and throwing them, taking up Molotov cocktails, throwing them. Obviously there are a number of groups inside who do a few operations here and there, blowing up an Israeli army vehicle, for example, with some explosives, but there weren't many of these attacks. There were, but they were few and far between. The majority of the uprising was all based on stones, Molotov cocktails, breaking the roadblocks, and civil disobedience. However, they didn't know how to respond, and so they responded with violence, and they would just open fire, not just rubber bullets. They were using live rounds. Beatings. Anybody who was known to take part in any of these demonstrations, they would come down and beat them, chase them into their homes, beat them in their homes. Imprisonment. Imprisonment was used as a key deterrent for taking part in the Intifada, because if you take part in the Intifada, even for throwing a stone, you will get imprisonment term. So Israel was taken by surprise. They weren't expecting Intifada. It was just suddenly just happened. The Palestinian leadership. So the Palestinian leadership was almost at this point basically irrelevant. They were in Tunisia. They were completely disconnected with what's happening in Palestine, and so they were also taken off guard. It was just a public uprising. So they were also taken off guard. In response, they established an organization within the boundaries of the land of Palestine was established in Gaza and the West Bank, which was called the UNLU, which is basically the United Organization for the Leadership of the Palestinians. And it was mainly this group that was the front eventually for the PLO and other organizations during the Intifada. So the first statement that was made by any group or official statement that was made regarding the Intifada was on the 14th of December. So a few days after the first demonstrations. And this statement was signed by the Islamic Resistance Movement. Islamic Resistance Movement, which is the English for the Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya. So this movement was born out from what we discussed with regards to the Islamic Center, So this was an offshoot of the Islamic Center, or you could say it was a movement as part of the Islamic Center. And this is the foundation of the organization of Hamas in 1987. So it wasn't. So this was the first announcement that was made. So this organization, the Islamic Resistance Movement makes the first statement on the 14th of December. So they're the first organization to put out any kind of statement with regards to the Intifada and the uprising. They call on the people of Gaza to rise up against the Israeli oppression. They ask them to do basically these actions that we've discussed here, civil disobedience, etc. It was generally non-violent. That was the order, to be non-violent, just blocking roads, burning tires. They could use stones and Molotov cocktails, but that's about it. And that was the announcement that was made. And also what they used to do was they used to announce days when they would go on strike. They would announce times when they would go on strike. So what would happen is that they would say in every week you would have a maximum of 2 days where we can go on strike. Also, it is a maximum of 2 consecutive days of striking. The reason for this was that if it was to be continuous, the people won't be able to have the appetite to continue. The people won't be able to have the appetite to continue because it'll have an impact on their lives. It'll have an impact on their livelihood. It'll have an impact on their income, etc. So what they would do is they would specify times and days when the people should strike. And so in this way it was organized. In that a statement would be released. It would say everyone will be gathering in, for example, Khan Yunus. People will be gathering in Rafah. People will be gathering in Gaza. People will be gathering in Jabalia. And so the people will know where the resistance will be. They'll also know, or the uprising will be. They'll also know which hours the shops will be closed and the roads will be blocked. So the Palestinians also know, and any businessmen know, that they should not move around during these hours. They'll know which hours it's open. So the shopkeepers will open their shops at those times, and the people will go to the shops at those times. So one of the questions I was asked to one of those who were organizing the Intifada at the time was that how were people living? How are people living if this is going on for 4 years and they're blocking roads, they're throwing stones, etc. They're striking, they're not working. How are people getting around? How are people living on a daily basis? So he said, the answer that he gave was that Alhamdulillah, it didn't really have much impact on us in terms of our livelihood. Because what used to happen was the shopkeeper would normally open, let's say 8 o'clock in the morning, close at 6 in the evening. Okay, so he's open for about 10 hours a day, 12 hours a day. Instead of opening all of those hours, the times or the hours that he opens are limited. He opens for 2 hours. He opens from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. only. Everyone usually used to shop spread throughout the day between the 10, 12 hours that he was open. Now instead everyone shops within those 2 hours. So everyone needs shopping, needs the basic necessities anyway. The amount that they need is the same. But instead of buying it over 12 hours or 10 hours, they buy it over 2 hours. So whatever he was selling, he continued to sell just in a shorter period of time. And whatever they needed to buy, they were buying anyway, just within a shorter time frame. So in that way, the businesses continued to run, the traders made their money, and the people bought their goods. And at the same time, they were able to take part in the striking and the Intifada as well. However, the Israeli forces, what they used to do was they used to barricade certain areas. So as we mentioned, like in when the war was taking place, and they initially occupied Gaza and they had surrounded the As-Safwah refugee camp. In the same way, they came and they surrounded the As-Safwah refugee camp again, and they blocked off all access. It was only open for 2 hours a day. They cut off water, they cut off electricity, they cut off food, they cut off everything to the As-Safwah refugee camp. For 2 hours a day, it was possible for people to come in and out with permission from the Israeli authorities. Now the people in As-Safwah, they had no money, they couldn't really purchase anything. What could they do? But they were surprised as soon as the Israeli forces opened the corridor for people to come in, suddenly there are cars and so many people coming in carts with food. So what was happening was while the refugee camps on the coast are surrounded, all the rest of the people in Gaza, they are gathering food the whole day. They're gathering food the whole day and they're preparing it. As soon as Israel says there's a 2-hour window, they all rush to the refugee camp to provide them with food. So they said even though we were surrounded and besieged for days, nobody went hungry because all the people of Gaza were gathering food to come and feed us during this 2-hour window that they were given on a daily basis. So in this way, the Palestinians were working together, and there was a lot of understanding on how they needed to conduct themselves with regards to the situation that they were in at the start of the Intifada. Now, specifically with regards to the first statement that came out, so on the 9th, as this was a surprise to everyone, on the 10th, the committee of the Islamic Center, they sat down and they had a discussion, and they said that it is we need to do something in order to organize these protests that are taking place. They then said, okay, who will be able to help out and go out in the streets to organize the next demonstration. The next day was Jum'ah. So 9th, 10th, they had the meeting. 11th was Jum'ah. So they said, okay, we'll be on the Saturday. As majority of them were imams of the masajid, it was difficult for them to be able to organize it. So they organized it in Saturday morning. So what they would do is they would start from a masjid. So on Saturday they started in Khan Yunus. They would start from a masjid. They would put on. They would have anashid from speakers. They would start moving from the masjid at approximately, let's say, 8 o'clock in the morning. Sometimes they would be carrying the janazah of someone, and so people would join. When they hear the anashid, they hear the chanting, people will join, and then eventually they would go towards Israeli security points, Israeli checkpoints, Israeli military outposts, police points, etc., and then block off the roads, and this would carry on throughout the day. And thereafter it'll go to another city. They'll have, among many of the people who would take part were students of the Islamic University of Gaza in the Intifada and the Islamic Center. And that's why as soon as any kind of confrontation used to take place, even in the years prior, the first thing that the Israeli government, the Israeli administration of Gaza used to do was close the university, the Islamic University. It's closed for students, closed for any classes. So again, on the same first, immediately they closed the university. And the blame at this point was pointed at the Islamic Center and the Islamic organizations that were based in Gaza, to start off with. Now the PLO was, as we said, they weren't initially involved, they were off guard. So what they did was they got together, communicated with those on the ground, communicated with the UNLU, and then eventually on the 8th of January, so approximately a month later, they released their first statement with regards to the uprisings and the Intifada. This then obviously made more of the Palestinians become involved, and it spread even more in the West Bank. So in the West Bank it hadn't been as widespread as it was in Gaza. After January it became much more widespread in the West Bank as well. And so as I said, these statements, what they used to do was they used to just call the Palestinians where, when, etc. to strike and demonstrate. So this is in brief what was taking place, and this took place. This was continuous for 4 years, all the way until 1991. The Israeli forces, in response to this, were quite brutal. So imprisonment. Over this period, 50,000 Palestinians were imprisoned. 50,000 Palestinians were imprisoned. Over 20,000 of them were imprisoned without trial for more than 6 months. For more than 6 months. And the minimum age for imprisonment for throwing stones was 12. Minimum age for imprisonment was 12. How old are you? 10. Or he wouldn't be imprisoned. But the father would have a hefty fine to pay. Yeah. So the minimum age was 12. For a person who threw stones and caused no injury, the sentence was 3 to 6 months in prison. 3 to 6 months in prison. And any neighborhoods where the demonstrations were taking place, etc., neighborhoods which they really didn't like, as we said, they would besiege them, cut them off from water, food, electricity, etc. Any individuals who they knew were key figures in the demonstrations or calling for demonstrations, etc., or who they had seen throwing stones or Molotov cocktails, they would go and destroy their houses, demolish their houses, just bulldoze them. Deportations. A number of leaders were deported. So 3 members of the committee and the shura of the Islamic Center, they were deported from Gaza, sent to other countries. 66 Palestinians during this whole period were deported from their own country. A few incidents, for example, Hani al-Shami, on the 22nd of August 1988, the Israeli forces were chasing a stone thrower. They chased him into the house of Hani al-Shami. So whether Hani al-Shami was a stone thrower or whether the person who was throwing stones ran into his house and ran on the other side, we will never know. They came inside the house. It was the house of Hani al-Shami. They beat him inside the house initially. They arrested him. They took him to prison. There he was beaten by the Israeli soldiers. He was thrown on the floor, kicked, etc. Thereafter, a medic was called to check on him. The medic came and said he's got bruises, etc., but he's okay. Like his health is okay. He's not. His health hasn't seriously been impacted. However, within a few days, he died in Israeli custody, and they said he has died. So this case was reoccurring. This is just a case study, but this was a reoccurring incident that took place. People would go into custody, then they say he's died in custody. It happens. It's been happening in the last 3 months, in the last 112 days. Similar stories of those who had been arrested from the West Bank and from Gaza in the Israeli prisons. This individual has died in prison because of ill health. The casualties altogether, the Palestinians, over 1,095 Palestinians were killed during this period. Over 1,095, and 15,000, more than 15,000 injured. More than 15,000 injured. On the other side, 100 or just over 100 Israelis were killed. Just over 100 Israelis were killed. And this Intifada, this uprising, was generally known to be non-violent. The Prime Minister of Israel at this time, Yitzhak Rabin, he was known by the Palestinians, and is known by the Palestinians until today as the bone breaker. As the bone breaker. Because he said they will learn to not pay taxes. They will learn to not follow the rule of the law. This was his command. Or this was his statement when the Palestinians said we're not going to pay tax, and the Arab League said that they will support the Palestinians in the Intifada and fund them if needed. And so he ordered a savage crackdown on anyone who took part. And that was everything that we can see. This was a direct result of the Israeli Prime Minister's command. And he was seen from those who are, you could say, more liberal, left on the political spectrum, and from the up-and-coming left parties. They call them the eagles and the doves. So he was supposed to be a dove, but he's known as the bone breaker. The amount of Palestinians who are injured, as we said, over 15,000 bones broken. A very common feature of this uprising was Palestinians going into hospital with broken bones, and therefore he was called the bone breaker. And so this is the first Intifada in summary. And this continued, as we said, all the way until October 1991, which then resulted in a number of major political events that took place, meaning the Oslo Accords. Before we go to the Oslo Accords, there are two individuals who are very important for us to discuss, as they played a key role at this point in time in what was taking place in Palestine. So the first individual is Sheikh Ahmed Yasin. So Sheikh Ahmed Yasin was born in 1936. He was born in 1936. And the place he was born was a village called Al-Jura, just outside the city of Asqalan. Just outside the city of Asqalan. And we mentioned, I think we've discussed that Asqalan is about 8 kilometers north of Gaza. So it's just outside Gaza. So it's not far from Gaza. However, in 1948, when he's 12 years old and the Israeli state is declared, the family has to relocate as refugees to Gaza, and they settle eventually in the As-Safwah refugee camp. They settle in As-Safwah refugee camp. At the age of approximately 16, while he's still studying, he suffers from an injury to his spine, which leads him to be wheelchair bound as a quadriplegic for the rest of his life, unable to use his arms, unable to use his legs. Now he was in prison. He was in hospital in a cast for about 45 days. He then was discharged from the hospital, but he had to have continuous medical treatment. He wished to go back to school. Initially, the school said, "How can you come back?" But he said, "No, I will go." Now, initially, following his injury, he was able to walk, although not as a normal person would walk. His legs were very weak, so any little trip, uneven ground would cause him to fall, etc. But he was able to walk and go to school. He completed his studies. He then studied for a while in Egypt. Was unable to finish the full course in Egypt. Came back, studied under a number of scholars, etc., who are in Gaza. He applied for a teaching job at a local school to teach Arabic, etc. He received, this was during the Egypt administration of Gaza. In his application, he was one of so you have thousands of applicants for these jobs. The jobs are decided by the Egyptian ministry, who's in control. He received one of the top marks in terms of the form for examination for teachers. Initially, the head teacher of the school said, "We cannot employ you because of your medical condition." But he complained. He was then taken to the senior Egyptian official who was in charge of Gaza, and he said, "No, give him his job because he passed. See how he goes. If he can't teach in his condition, then you can fire him." But he was seen as he was popular with the students. He was a charismatic figure. The students began to like him. He had an Islamic mindset. Obviously, he had studied Islam. So as part of his conditions for his students, he used to tell them that they had to attend 2 additional classes in the masjid, separate from the school. So he used to take his students, teach them in the school, then teach them 2 more classes in the masjid every week. And he was the imam of the masjid in the As-Safwah refugee camp. Eventually, through his work, etc., and with the people he works with, they established the Islamic Center, which we mentioned already, in 1973. So the Islamic Center is founded by Sheikh Ahmed Yasin and a number of other individuals. And he continues in his da'wah activities, traveling across mainly Gaza to give lessons, etc., and lead Jumu'ah. He is first imprisoned in 1984. In 1984. So before the uprising in 1987, we have the Lebanon War in 1982. In the middle, the PLO is out of the picture almost, and until this point, he's not involved in any kind of resistance, in terms of armed resistance. In his biography, he was offered to be part of Fatah and the other organizations. However, he refused on the basis that these organizations, even though they were secular, they were not Islamic. So that was a problem. There wasn't a problem to stop him joining. His issue with those organizations was that they were paramilitary organizations that were based in other countries. So they were based in Jordan, they were based in Syria, they were based in Egypt, they were based in Lebanon. And his argument was that by these Palestinian organizations being based in these countries, and these countries not having an appetite for a war with Israel, this will cause conflict between the Palestinian organizations and the governments of those countries. And this was his reason, and his reasoning was, you could say, sound, as we saw what happened in Egypt. All the Palestinians groups who were there were removed from Egypt in and exiled to other countries. The ones who were in Jordan, we had Black September. They went to Syria. Many of them were banned from Syria, apart from the government-sponsored few organizations. And they went to Lebanon. Then in Lebanon, you had the Lebanon War, and eventually they had to go all the way to Tunisia. And then there was systematic assassinations that were taking place by the Israeli agencies in Tunisia. And so you have. So this was his initial reason. In 1984, once he had built up a number of followers, etc., and he had a number of secret groups, so he'd have like a number of private individuals, small groups here, and another small group there who did not know each other, he decided to start an armed uprising. Through some funding, etc., external funders and people he knew, they managed to purchase 80 pieces of weaponry, 80 weapons, and they were stored in the places that were underneath the Islamic Center. But only a handful of people knew about it. However, a few of the individuals were arrested, tortured, and eventually they told the Israeli forces who were torturing them, interrogators, that Sheikh Ahmed Yassin is in charge, and he's the one who has instructed us, and the stockpiles of weapons are in this masjid and in this center. And so Sheikh Ahmed Yassin was arrested in 1984 on the charge of stockpiling weapons and for fighting against Islamic resistance against the Israeli government. So this was the first time somebody was arrested on an Islamic charge by the Israeli government. When he was charged and they asked him, "What are you doing?" He said, "I am doing an Islamic uprising against you, and I want to overthrow the Israeli government." So he was very straightforward in the interrogation. Anyway, so he was sentenced for over 15 years in prison. However, the following year there was an exchange of prisoners that took place with a number of Israelis who were released in response to over approximately 1,100 Palestinians, which was known as the Jibril exchange in 1985. And as part of that, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin was released. Now, until he went to prison in 1984, he was still, with the aid of others, able to walk. However, when he was arrested in 1984, they took him to the police station. They then provided him with a chair and said, "We are not going to hold you and make you walk around everywhere," because he used to do the khutbah of Jumu'ah. He would be assisted to the minbar, then holding on to the minbar, he'd give the khutbah and then come down, and that's how he would get around. He didn't use the chair much. But once they went to prison, they said, "We're not going to walk around holding you in prison, so here's a chair, sit inside it." Obviously the treatment in prison wasn't so well, so once he was released from prison in 1985, he was unable to walk after that, and so he was wheelchair bound from 1984 when he entered into prison. He continued. Then in 1987, obviously he founded the Islamic resistance movement, Al-Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya or Hamas, and this was when the armed resistance started. Now, obviously, initially the resistance was through the Intifada, but he had about 10 individuals. There were 10 individuals who were part of the armed resistance. So they just had 10 individuals, and there were two separate units, and the 5 members of this unit did not know the 5 members of the other unit. And in Eid in 1989. On the day of Eid, one of these units carried out a number of bombings on Israeli military vehicles. So on Eid day, they detonated a few explosives, and they carried out a number of other operations. And eventually, a member of that unit, those 5 individuals, was arrested. and as a result they went through torture, etc., until he gives the next person's name who he's tortured, etc., until he gives the next person's name, and eventually that unit of 5 were arrested, and Sheikh Ahmed Yassin was arrested on the 18th of May 1989, and the charges against him were the killing of 2 Israeli soldiers. Obviously he wasn't directly involved. That unit had killed 2 soldiers, but he was charged with waging war against Israel, so he was sentenced to life in prison plus 15 years. So the 15 years are included in that life imprisonment. Eventually he was exchanged in a prison release in 1997, which we will discuss when we get to it. And then the rest of his life we'll discuss later on. But this was the start, the initial few years. So when he was arrested in 1989, he was arrested alongside majority of all the other leaders of the Islamic Center. So they were all arrested at the same time. In fact, Israel arrested approximately 1,200 to 1,500 individuals who they all said were members of, who are all the members of the Islamic resistance movement. They were taken into prison and they were all locked up. Sheikh Ahmed Yassin was taken into prison. His son was 16 years old. They took his son with him and they said, you need to look after your father in prison. We're not going to look after him. Who's going to take him around? He's wheelchair bound. But on the first day, they tortured and beat his son up in front of him to get him to confess, and thereafter he was imprisoned. Thereafter he was located from one, or transferred from different prisons to different prisons at different points in time. But he always was placed with 2 individuals to look after him and serve him in prison by the Israeli authorities. So what they initially would do is they would get any 2 Palestinian prisoners, put them in the prison cell with him, and tell them, you need to look after his needs because he's paralyzed, he can't do it himself. We won't do it for him, you can do it for him. After a couple of years, however, the 2 individuals who were initially chosen by the Israeli government were then chosen by the resistance movement and Sheikh Ahmed Yassin himself. So what they would do is they would tell the Israelis, okay, they would put them on a rota of about 3 months or a few months, and Sheikh Ahmed Yassin would say, okay, I want this individual and this individual to come and stay with me for the next period. So whoever's names were given, those are the people who will be put in the cell with him and thereafter changed. So he would choose from a list. Now, once he was in prison, and as we said, they carried out mass imprisonment. So they arrested over 1,200 to 1,500 individuals, meant to be all of the members of the Islamic resistance movement in Gaza. And they said to him and all the other members that your movement is finished, the Islamic Center is done, for we've arrested all of the members. So you might as well just give up everyone, give up everything, and not have any kind of thought for the future that this is going to continue. And these are the early days of the resistance movement. A couple of weeks go by, and suddenly they see that the announcements, if you remember, there were announcements that were coming out from the Islamic resistance movement with regards to the demonstrations and the Intifada, they continue. And there are still announcements being made in the name of the Islamic resistance movement. The papers keep coming out, the demonstrations keep happening. So they take him to interrogation. They tell him, we've arrested all of these people. Who's coming out with these statements? Who's coming out with these statements? So he said, the system that we have put in place is a system you can't destroy it. There is always somebody who will replace the person who is gone. So this was at the start in 1987, 1989, when the numbers were very few, and they had arrested basically everyone who they had thought were members of the organization, approximately 1,500 people. All of the known members of the Shura or the council were all arrested in prison. Some of them were exiled abroad. But even then, somehow the organization continued, and they continued just as they were before. All of these 1,500 were imprisoned. And so this was the start of Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. Then you have on the other side, you have Yasser Arafat. So these are the two main individuals who play significant roles in these years. So Yasser Arafat was born in 1929, so a few years before Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. His name was actually Muhammad Abdul Rahman. His name was actually Muhammad Abdul Rahman. However, he took on his grandfather's name, whose name was Yasser. His surname also was not Arafat, but he took on the name Arafat from his extended family. He was born in Cairo, in Egypt. His father was of dual lineage, so his grandmother was Egyptian, his grandfather was Palestinian. His mother was originally from Al-Quds. Education, he studied in the university in Egypt. He graduated as a civil engineer, and he was the president of the General Union of Palestinian Students, the International Union for Palestinian Students, during the 1950s, during the years that he was at the university. He was initially in Egypt. In the 1948 war, he stopped his studies. He took part in the 1948 war. He joined the Muslim Brotherhood battalions that were fighting, units that were fighting in Gaza. He joined and fought with them in Gaza in 1948. Thereafter, in 1949, he returned back to Cairo. Eventually, he continued his studies, graduated as a civil engineer. He then moved to a number of countries, eventually settling in Kuwait. He eventually settled in Kuwait. There, through his contacts and his friends, he started teaching in Kuwait. And through his contacts, etc., who were there, eventually they got together. And in the year 1959, exactly which month is unknown, but in the year 1959, the organization of Fatah was founded. His co-founders were two individuals, Abu Iyad and Abu Jihad. These were the three individuals who founded Fatah. The reason why I didn't put a profile for Abu Iyad and Abu Jihad is because they were killed early on. Abu Jihad was assassinated in Malta. So he was the second in charge of Fatah, or he was the deputy of Yasser Arafat during this period. So in 1989 he was assassinated in Malta, where he had a stop-off while he was flying from one place to another. The Israeli agents came and they shot him and they killed him. So he was assassinated during the First Intifada, the deputy of Yasser Arafat. So he establishes the Fatah organization in 1959, and in 1969 he becomes and is designated as the leader of the PLO. So he becomes the leader of the PLO in 1969. He had, again, his outlook was, as we said, secular, nationalist. His to deny this existence of the state of Israel, so no recognition of the state of Israel, return to the full Palestinian land, or the Palestinian mandate that was under the British before the establishment of the state of Israel through armed resistance. He was the leader of the PLO in Jordan, so he was the leader of the PLO in Karama, in the battle that took place when Israel went over the border into Jordan and attacked the town, which was seen as the first a victory for the Palestinian resistance in Jordan. Thereafter, he was a leader of Fatah in Jordan during Black September, where the war took place with the Jordanian government. Thereafter, he went to Lebanon. Again, he was a leader of the resistance in Lebanon in the war against Israel in 1982. Thereafter, he moved to Tunisia, and then eventually, after 1991 and the incidents that take place afterwards, and his shift in terms of his political and paramilitary activities, he changes, and thereafter he moves to Gaza. And that is where he stays until his death. So these are the two key individuals who played a major role at this point in time, and in fact throughout the last couple of decades, and have molded what came afterwards and what exists today in terms of the land of Palestine. Inshallah, we'll stop here today. We've gone slightly extended session today, but inshallah next week we'll continue with the Oslo Accords and the culmination of the First Intifada and what that meant for the Palestinians, inshallah ta'ala. Before we finish, if there's any questions on today's session. No? Okay, alhamdulillah. Inshallah. So we ask that Allah Azza wa Jal enable us to take lessons and heed the correct way, in the way that is correct according to the light of the Quran.